welcome to McGee House. We're really glad you could be with us today. We're going to come in and take a tour of the house. Before we go in, I just wanted to tell you that this house was built from a kit. It was like a model car or a model truck, sort of. Every piece was already sawed up to the right sizes, even the trim you see on the porch. It was built in 1887 by Samuel Church Smith. Come on in and let's go through the home. This is the living room, or parlor, as it would have been called in those days. When it was first built, this is a portrait of Samuel Church Smith, the man who built the house, and he was a partner of Gerhard Schutte, and they built the Carlsbad Hotel next to the mineral springs well that we talked about when History Trunk came to your school. He didn't do too well. They weren't as successful as I thought they would be, and he went on down to San Diego and he sold the house to the Shipley family, Alexander and Julia, who had a little girl named Florence. Okay, and the paintings that you see on the walls belonged to the Shipley family. We have actually a painting of Yosemite Valley over there, and the Adirondack Mountains, Sable Lake. And the paintings are by a man named Hugo Fisher. You can look him up online and learn all about that artist. And the painting over here on the far wall is of Mr. Shipley's uncle. That would have been Florence's great uncle. We have a number of nice pieces in this house. The clock belonged in the Schutte mansion, and it was donated to the Historical Society. Belonged to the Schutte family. The piano was donated by the Kelly family, and you know about the Kellys. You learned about them in the Rancho days in California. We're going to move on into the west bedroom now. Okay, this is the west bedroom of the house, and this crazy quilt on the wall was made by Mr. Smith's first wife and daughter. In those days, they did things like this to kind of have all parts of family history. It has some really interesting things on it, but the one I'm going to point out to you in particular is this ribbon that came from the first centennial of this country's history in 1876 in Philadelphia. It has a picture of George Washington on it, and the Liberty Bell, and the date that they were there. Okay. A little bit of other family history. We know that there was someone who played the piano and had children. We know they traveled to England. There are pound notes here. We know that they were in the Nebraska blizzard, January 7th, 1886. So it was very common in those days to do family history, bits of things like that. You will find that the bed and the dresser were also from the Schutte mansion, as well as this couch and chair. They were actually used by Gerhard Schutte and his family, and we've had them donated to the Historical Society. The trunk you see on the floor was Julia Shipley's traveling trunk. It contained a lot of family letters and bills where they had ordered things from San Francisco and the East Coast and so forth. You can see Julia's initials on the side. And we have copies of these letters up in the Carlsbad History Room at Cole Library. You can go and read those letters that were written between Mrs. Shipley and her daughter Florence when she was away at school, and some letters between Florence and her husband Hugh when they were courting. This is the dressing room off of the west bedroom. We have a collection of Victorian lingerie from the late 1800s all the way up through 1920s and 30s. Look at the corset on the dressmaker's dummy there. Can you imagine wearing something that tight? And you can see how they lace them up tight to give them a nice tiny waistline in those days. Gloves on because I'm going to be handling things, and this is a museum and we don't want to put our hands with oily and fingerprints on any of the antique things. We'll destroy them. This is the dining room. I want you to take a look up at the high ceilings. Remember the ceilings in this house, and we'll talk about why those ceilings were so high. And I want you to look at the furniture over here. This was Florence's. Was in the house when Florence McGee died. The couch and chair were hers. This little wood stove is the way that they heated the homes, and they would have a stovepipe up and burn wood in it, and they could get in like this and put wood on the top and check and make sure that it was okay. All right. That was donated by Joyce Smith, one of our Historical Society members, that belonged to her grandmother and was in her house down on 1st Street in Carlsbad. This was the original dining room of the house. And we're going to go through this into this. This was not the original kitchen. This is sort of we've set this up the way a kitchen might have looked, and we'll go into the real kitchen later. But I want to show you some interesting kinds of things in here. We have a really nice dress of that time era that a woman would have used to wear around the house for every day, and maybe throw a sweet little tea apron on like that if company came. The stove is a later date. It's about 1920, 1930. It was a gas stove. The original stove in here would have been a wood-burning stove. Okay, this was in the kitchen. These dishes came out of what became the Twin Inns. The Shooty Mansion was sold and became the Twin Inns. And they used these dishes, and they were very famous for serving their chicken dinners. And when we go to the barn, you will see one of the big chickens that was out in front of the Twin Inns to advertise their chicken dinners. This is the way people kept their food cold. It was called an ice box. And they would put an ice block up in here. We know that cold air sinks, goes down. So the ice would go up here and cold would seep down, and the food was kept down here. As the ice melted, it went down a pipe underneath, and there was a tray that collected the water, and you had to empty that tray of water every single day of the week. This is the way that women washed their clothes in those days. They heated water, hauled in the wood, heated water, and they had made soap before. Soap took about 3-4 weeks to make. And they used a washboard to rub the clothes on, and with their soap in big pots like this. And later on, they got this wonderful thing that was a hand wringer, would wring the clothes and dry them, so they didn't have to twist them and dry them anymore. So it was quite a labor-saving device of the time. Your kitchens and work on just plain wood, sometimes painted. Sometimes they would have a piece of a cloth that they called oilcloth with a shiny side taped on the top or tacked on the top. And they would bake their bread in here. Down below were these bins where they could keep their flour and sugar and salt. And then all the implements that they needed were in here, and they could make the bread on top and do a lot of other cooking kinds of things. Very handy for that time. Very, very small cabinet. I just wanted to point out a couple of things in here. One of the earliest steam irons. It weighs about 8 pounds. Very heavy, almost 10 pounds. And just open it up and poured water in here. And there you went. Before that, they had to heat irons on in the fire to use iron the clothes. Couple of things in here, some old medicine in here, but every family in town had 2 things on their shelf to take care of the family. They had liniment that they would rub on sores on the outside of the body, and they had castor oil that they would give to people to take every couple of months to take care of the inside of the body. I'm going to point out the sliding doors that would divide the dining room that you're in and the living room, so that they could close off the dirty dishes and whatever and keep the company in the parlor. Remember those high, remember how tall notice how tall these doors are. Remember I said the ceilings were so high because they didn't have electricity. No fans, no cooling system, so they knew that hot air rises, so that's why they had the ceilings so high, so the hot air could go up in the summertime and they could be more comfortable down closer to the floor. This was the original kitchen, and you can see where the stovepipe was, and this is where the wood-burning stove would have been located. And next to it was a pass-through to the dishes and the cupboard that they could also reach from the dining room. And behind us, as you can see as we go around, there are 2 doors here, and these were pantry areas, sort of like a big walk-in closet with shelves where they could keep their food and their dishes. Okay. And as we look over this way, this little room we now have set up as a little office area. But at one time, when Florence McGee was living in this house, this was a sunroom, and there was a couch in here, and she would sit on the couch and do her crocheting and so forth, and look out the window and watch what was going on in the world. In the dining room area, what was the dining room, we have set up a display about the schools in Carlsbad. And we have here a model of the Calavera School. It was a school that was set up way outside of town for the ranchers' children who couldn't get into town to go to school. And there's a photograph of the real school right up here. And it closed in 1919 when they began attending the school downtown Carlsbad. Downtown they had the Carlsbad School on Pine Avenue, and that's located right now where the senior citizen is located, senior center, and the Pine Avenue Park is located right now, and that's where one of the very first schools was. This is the east bedroom, and it's full of some fascinating things. As we look around the room, this is called a chaise lounge. It was also called a fainting couch, and ladies would lie on that, sit up and back, and read their books and fan themselves. It's called a fainting couch because, remember the corset that I showed you? They were sometimes laced so tight that ladies couldn't breathe very well, and they would faint. And they would lay them out and loosen up their corsets as they lay on the couch to relax. You might find in most bedrooms you would have the pitcher and basin like this that people use to get washed up in the mornings. And men worked with the old-fashioned straight razors that would open up, and they would shave the face like this with this kind of a razor. Then they went to some very interesting new things. It was called a safety razor, and the blade would go inside here, and then they wouldn't cut themselves up as they could with the old type of knife. Some of the things in here are very interesting. This hat was owned by Mrs. McGee when she was an older lady living here in the house, and she never went outside without having a hat on. And she used the sun hat when she went out to feed her chickens and work in the yard and pick her flowers because she didn't want sun on her face. Ever. We have some really interesting little shoes here that I wanted to show you, the style of shoes that people wore in those days. Now these are little models. The shoe salesman took these around to the houses so people could see what kind of shoe they wanted to order. Notice the buttons that come up the side. Those are not decoration. They put those on. They put a hook through the buttonhole and pull the button through the hook with this little button hook to fasten the shoes all the way up. These shoes actually did belong to some young child. You can see they're well worn. And can you imagine trying to get a 2-year-old baby to sit still long enough to hook up these shoes? Quite a job, I think. This bed is what many early families in California and across the nation had, and instead of springs, they had ropes that they tightened up, and they would put the mattress on, sometimes just a ticking like this that buttoned up and was filled with grasses and straw and hay, and when it got dirty or the bugs came in, they would just empty it out and put new hay in, right? And the ropes would get loose after a while, and they had a little tool where they could tighten up the rope. That's where the phrase sleep tight comes from. All this dresser was, this is very typical of the kinds of furniture that would have been in the house. The hats are the kind of hats that ladies wore to be very elegant and very fancy. This is a very small one. This hat actually is from 1870 to 1890 from New York City, sort of like this. And they had these huge long hat pins that they would use to pin the hat into their tall hair, right? Okay. And filled with lots of feathers and elegant things on it. And as we come around, I wanted to point out some other clothing in the house. Women often looked like they were wearing dresses, but they would often be in 2 pieces instead of fastened together, with a skirt and then a top that came down over, so that often it looked like a full dress but wasn't. They also would wear the short jackets like this. This is a very elegant kind of a jacket that a woman would wear over an evening gown or a long velvet skirt out for the day. The other thing that they all had were their Parasols. Women had to keep the sun off of their faces. They just didn't believe in getting sun on their faces, and they often had either a